Hi, Denise Gwen, reading aloud for you from my novel, His Christmas Eve Proposal, Book 3 of the Medicine Women of Alaska, Chapter 36. If Drew had stood there 1 second longer, she might have stepped forward and asked him to take her into his arms. But just as she turned to grab a tissue to blow her nose, he took that as a final rejection and stomped out of her office. What he'd said to her was mean, so mean, but she'd hurt him too. Why'd she have to accuse him of being weak? That was so mean. She doubted he could ever forgive her for saying such a hateful, mean thing. She peered through her office window and watched as he stalked across the street. He didn't walk into his office, as she'd hoped, because she thought she'd give him a chance to cool down, then go over there and apologize. But instead, she saw him walk around the building to the parking lot in the back. A few moments later, his truck tore down Main Street, and she suspected he was heading home. She could still chase after him. If she wanted to, that is. She loved him. She loved him more than she'd ever loved any man in her life, and she realized with a start, she loved him so much more than she'd ever loved Ricardo. She'd wanted to protect Drew from the horrendous backlash that'd fall upon her head when the world discovered that she'd had the nerve to perform a dangerous operation on her former fiancé when she could easily have handed the job over to someone else. Then again, she realized ruefully, if she hadn't inserted the chest tube, people would have still blamed her. No matter what she did, they'd blame her. The tidal wave of guilt and recrimination and blame was going to carry her away, and she didn't want Drew swept up into the tsunami. He didn't realize it right this minute, but as soon as the world started talking, his own medical practice would be called into question. Naomi was trying to protect him. She couldn't destroy the medical practice that he'd inherited from his grandfather and then from his father. He'd worked so hard to build the practice, and she'd single-handedly destroy it if she brought him down with her. She didn't want to be just another runaway bride. And then a thought hit her. What made her think she'd jilt Drew at the altar? She had a funny feeling that if Drew wanted to marry her, she sure wouldn't abandon him at the altar. She loved him too much to do that. And then a thought hit her. What made her think she'd jilt Drew at the altar? She had a funny feeling that if Drew wanted to marry her, she sure wouldn't abandon him at the altar. She loved him too much to do that. But it was better that she give him up before she ruined his career. The only problem being, she was so very lonely. She'd grown weary of running away from her problems. She'd been wrong to call Drew a coward. She was the coward because every time things got tough, she ran like she was doing now. She was being too hard on herself and had to remind herself of the one good thing she'd done. She hadn't run away when Jackson was dying. She'd stayed with him, even though it'd been terrible to watch her brother die. She staggered away from the window, collapsed onto her office chair, and wept. She lifted her head at the sound of a knock on her front door. Oh, I hope it's Drew. She hoped, she longed to know that it was Drew coming back for her. On his way out of town, he'd reconsidered and then turned his truck back around and driven to see her. He'd demand that she take him back, but a rational part of her recalled how quickly he'd driven out of town. She ought to know Drew better than that. If she knew Drew the way she felt she did, he would have either driven home or to the park where they'd hiked that morning. Was it possible it'd been only 3 days earlier? It was more likely a patient who hadn't received word that she was leaving. She simply wasn't up to the prospect of having to talk to a patient, and as far as she knew, her office looked closed. Only Drew had noticed that she was in, and she didn't know how he'd sensed that, but that was her Drew. She'd ignore the person knocking on her door. But then the person really started pounding. Really? Couldn't the person tell that she wasn't here? Naomi, an eerily familiar voice called out. Naomi, it's your father. Dad? She looked up, startled. Naomi, are you there, honey? Please, Naomi, let me in. She wiped the tears from her eyes as she jumped to her feet and flung open the door, and there stood her father, one of the most important men in her life, someone she'd been missing for a long time. What are you doing here? She choked out, which probably wasn't the nicest thing to say to a man who traveled over 3,000 miles to find her. The last time she'd seen her father was at her aborted wedding, when he caught up to her in the vestry, demanding to know what was going on. But before she got an answer out of him, he stepped forward and, with tears in his eyes, wrapped her up in his arms. The sensation of his strong arms around her shoulders felt so comfortingly familiar that tears welled up in her eyes and she sobbed. He held her for a long time as she wept out her pain and her sorrow and her loneliness. When she finally pulled gently out of his arms and reached for a box of tissues, she regained the power of speech. Dad, I didn't expect to see you ever again. Here, he said, can I lock your door? Ever practical Dad. Sure. He locked the door and then stepped close to her again. Well, I was standing in line at the grocery store, and I happened to take a glance at the national tabloid magazines. And whose beautiful face do I happen to see but my only daughter? Don't tell me you bought a copy of that magazine, she asked, smiling through her tears. I stopped after 20, he said proudly. I basically bought out the supply. She laughed, a genuine, heartfelt, happy laugh. Her dad had always supported her in all her endeavors. And when she went to medical school, he took on a second job to spare her from the burden of massive student loan debt upon graduation. That's just the kind of dad Hugh Schuster was. And then when she started dating Ricardo Velasquez and the press started noticing, she started appearing on the cover of the tabloid magazines. And her dad, proud dad had gone out every time her face got splashed across the cover of some magazine and bought out their entire supply. She wasn't quite sure what to make of it. She hated the way she looked, but everyone assured her she was beautiful. And besides all that, she really didn't care. But her dad said he loved to stay on top of her social exploits. At the back of her mind, she wondered if he'd stayed on top of it when she was being derided in the press. But she suspected that on those occasions, he'd limited his purchases to only 1 or 2 copies of the magazines. "So there I am," he said, as if reading her thoughts, "standing in line at the grocery mart, waiting to buy a box of figs and yogurt and coffee because your mother and I forgot to get them the day before when we did our big grocery run. And who should I see gracing the cover of the hottest tabloid but my own beautiful daughter?" Despite her terrors and the fears of a massive lawsuit filed by the Velazquez family for a claim of medical malpractice and the difficult time she'd no doubt endure at the hands of the medical board, she smiled wryly. "I'm apparently the father of a movie star," he continued, "and I'd been disappointed that the press's coverage of you had dropped down to a trickle, really, until I saw my daughter on a magazine again, informing the world of her whereabouts." He winked at her. "That's how I stay in touch, you see, with my favorite daughter." "I see." Her cheeks rippled with shame. She hadn't spoken to her dad since their angry exchange in the narthex on her way out the door, still unmarried and in her white wedding dress. "And then," her dad said, "on my way out here, I got a call from your mom." "Mom?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "But I haven't talked to Mom since the wedding." "No, honey. I meant your biological mother."